What is the crack, everyone? It's Nathan, aka the Rambling Kern, and head instructor of Kern School of Combat. So today's video is all about making these reproduction medieval arrows. So these arrows are made as close as I can to authentic medieval arrows. There are differences. I will outline some of them during the video, but overall most of the materials used and the methods used are accurate to historical examples. So for these, the actual materials are red silk for the bindings, buffalo horn for the knock reinforcements, it is a poplar shaft, and it is dyed turkey feather to make it look like goose feather. And rather than a historical bodkin, I have what are called modkins, which you'll see in the video in a minute. Now, I had a few reasons for doing this video. One, I needed some new arrows. Two, I wanted to document the process. I wanted to show you guys that with minimal equipment, it is possible to make really great arrows that will last you quite some time. It doesn't have to be an extremely complicated process, and all you need is a desk with which you can work at to do these. So I really suggest you go out and, if you're interested, try making some of these. It is really, really fun and really enjoyable, and each one you will get better with. Now, if you haven't already, please do like this video and subscribe to the channel. It's enough of me talking. We'll get into the making, and I'll talk to you at the end. Enjoy. So the first step in the process was to cut up these horn strips. Now, I didn't do the standard livery arrow dimensions, which would be 2 inches long. These strips themselves were 3 inches long, so I cut them to 1.5 inches and slightly wider than the arrow width. The reason for this was I was kind of nervous I might mess up the process, so that's how I did it. I first cut these up with a hacksaw in my hobby vise, and then removed the masking tape and was left with these strips ready for the next step. So the next step in the process is to mark out and cut our slot for the horn strips. So for these you want to go with the grain. So you can see here, this is the direction I want to cut down into the arrow. So I want to have the reinforcements going with the grain and then the actual knock going against the grain. This is very important. Now, I made my first rookie mistake here, which was to mark using pen. If you're ever marking on wood, use a pencil. It will be a lot easier to remove later on. So here I'm simply just marking these out to 1.5 inches depth and marking along the line that I want to cut down as well. So I want to make sure I'm cutting again in the direction of the grain. And this is also just to give me a visual cue sight on when I was actually cutting. So then I marked using the top mark where I was going to cut and just ran that down to meet up with the horizontal line. And this was going to be the full channel that I was going to cut to fit the horn reinforcement strips into. Now, for lighter poundage bows, these strips aren't a necessity, but for heavier poundage bows, they really do help. There is alternatives. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the buffalo horn that I'm using here. You can use regular horn. I've seen a lot of people who use synthetic reinforcements. I've even seen some people use chopped up credit cards. So you're definitely welcome to experiment with them. And like I said, not really necessary for lighter pound, but definitely for heavier poundage bows. So to do these, I started off just with the rod saw to get an initial cut. So this is a tile saw, sometimes called a rod saw. And this was just to get an initial groove with which to start my cut that I would then move on to the hacksaw with. And this is also where I made rookie mistake number 2. You can see the arrow is not actually straight in the vise here because of the table, so if you are doing this, make sure it's away from it. Now what I've done here is I have really simply masking taped 3 hacksaw blades together and put them into my hacksaw. As you can see, these 3 are exactly 2 mil in thickness, just a hair thicker, which is exactly what I need for the slot that I'm about to cut for these horn strips. And once that groove is cut, this is what you're left with. So for me, this was 1.5 inches deep, and like I said, just slightly over 2 mil in thickness, which is the exact dimensions I needed for these horn strips to fit into. And this is what it should look like once done. So for gluing in these horn reinforcements, I just had this basic high strength 2-part epoxy. Nothing fancy, it was something that I had in my toolbox. So I mixed up a bunch of this. Now one thing I will suggest is if you are using 2-part epoxy or something like this, just make sure to put in a good bit of it down into the base of the horn knock and in along the sides of it, especially if your cuts are in any way wonky like some of mine were. It will just fill in the voids and it will be good and sturdy. If you want, I just used this as a clear epoxy, so it doesn't really show up too visibly. I know some people like to use a dark or a black epoxy for this, and it can help definitely hide any mistakes that you might have made. Now, like I wanted to point out with these, the horn strips, are not necessary for lower poundage bows, but definitely something that you will want for higher poundage bows. It'll really make those knocks a hell of a lot stronger and less likely to split on you. So shove this down into the shaft and just wipe away any excess epoxy to avoid any mess later on down the line. So to make sure that there's even pressure on this and that there was no gaps, I shoved it into the hobby vise. This way I could tighten it up and make sure that there was no gaps and everything was sealed up properly. One thing I really highly suggest is if you can get a hobby vise like this, make sure you have one with these rubber jaws that you can take in and out. I was able to do 2 at a time, which is what I did for this. And this is what you're left with once it's all done. So there will be a slight excess like this to shave away. I just used a standard file, nothing fancy. Just note that the horn strips are quite tough, so you will need a decent file to do it. The other thing as well is there might be a little bit of excess epoxy, so definitely having the file will really help with that too. And that's all filed. This is what you're left with. I slightly rounded the tops at this point as well, just to give that nice rounded edge, which is what you want to do for this. So then I marked out the nocks, which are 1/4 of an inch deep. So this time I learned my lesson and did this with a pencil. And once again, I used my trusty hacksaw. I will say as well with this, make sure that there's plenty of tension on the hacksaw blades, because if there isn't, they kind of splay apart when you're starting to cut. Again, with this, I suggest using the rod saw just to get the initial cut. I found here on this one, the blades came apart slightly on me, but as well, the rod saw, as you get down to the base of the knock, will definitely help get more of a circular opening like you see here. And once that's all done, I just wanted to then put it back into the vise for just some final finishing. I just went over it with some fine grit sandpaper just to take away any burrs or any edges on it, and also just to even out the slot that I cut in it. And then I run over the tips with a file once again, and this is just to round out the end of it, give it that nice rounded shape. Really, it's personal preference as to what you want to do with this, but traditionally they did have this rounded shape, sometimes a bit more round than this one. And then what I did was get this small little round file and file in little grooves just as indexing points along the outside of the shaft. And these grooves are what you are left with when it is all complete. This is the equipment I use for cutting out my fletching. I know there's various different methods, but this is the one that I use. I have a fletching cutting template. This one is from Fairbow. However, if you want ones that will work for both right and left and don't want to buy separately, I really suggest checking out Heritage Archery's ones. This one from Fairbow is grand, but it only cuts right wing, so you have to make sure all your feathers are right wing for this as well. So I use this round craft cutting knife here. I leave a slight little excess on each end, so kind of in the region of about 10 mil on each end. And then I use a hobby knife just to clean up the back end of the fletching here. Just trim away any excess, make sure it's all nice and tidy, And then I'm left with my finished fletching to go onto the arrow. Now, some people will freehand on their fletchings. I use this. It is the Carroll jig. I will have a link down in the description for this. This is a phenomenal fletching jig. As you can see on the end there, different sizes for different shafts. You just rotate through and it slots into that little groove on the end there, which is where your knock's going to go. This one is amazing because it works for very, very long fletchings, which on a lot of historical arrows, especially war arrows, you tend to have in 6 to 7 inches or more. So definitely a very, very useful jig for that purpose. So as you can see here, you just slot it down, and then this little clasp on the end, you just swing over and tighten into place. A really great jig. Like I said, I'm going to leave this down in the description, and definitely worth checking out if you make arrows with longer fletchings like these. So one of the great things about this jig is it works with all sorts of diameters of shafts, and you just shove in the shaft, spin around that locking jaw, and the knock sits in this point here, and you're able to work with very big long fletchings, as you can see here. And then you just get your fletchings ready, put them into the jaws. So this is the 3 fletchings that I'm going to use for this arrow. I put them into these little clasps here and then slot them down into the grooves that you can see on the jig there. So there's 2 different glues I use. One is this NPV cement. It does dry clear, which is quite useful. But if you don't want to order that, the Gorilla Glue, especially the gel super glue, there's other brands do them. I really highly suggest using that. Don't use a standard super glue because sometimes it runs and leaves white stains. These gel super glues are really, really useful for all of your archery needs. They're quite cheap. They can be a little bit awkward to get out, as you can see here, and sometimes they'll come out a little bit thicker than you need, but pretty easy to wipe away and relatively cheap. I find some of the fletching glues can be quite slow to dry. These are very, very quick to dry and work an absolute treat, and you can use them for sealing up different parts of your arrow as well, which you'll see later on. So all I'm doing here is applying a nice even layer all the way down the bottom of the feather, and once this is done, I just flip it over, put it back in the jig, make sure it's sitting down nice and tightly on top of the arrow shaft, spin it around to the next position, and rinse and repeat. This is what the jig looks like once all 3 fletchings are in and sealed up. This is, like I said, really great little jig. I highly suggest getting that. And then you're just going to set that aside and move on to your next part of the process. Once all your fletching is dried, all you got to do is just slide off the clamps. Make sure obviously that the arrow doesn't come free like this, but if you just hold the arrow with your fingers, it should just slide right on up and out of there, and you are left with a nicely finished arrow. And as you can see here, really nice long clamps, which allows for nice big war arrows like these, and that is what you're left with, the finished final product. So the next step in the process is to mark out and prepare our points. For these arrows I used Modkins. These are machined target points made to look like Modkins. So I'm using a toothpick to measure the depth, and I'm marking that then up on my arrow shaft. With these points, they will be the diameter of the shaft itself, so you'll have to cut a shoulder into the shaft, which you'll see in a second. So what I do is get my knife, and I will cut a slight groove onto this depth all the way around the arrow, which is going to form my shoulder later on. And from here, this is then down to your own personal preference as to how you want to shape the shaft. So you can do it like this. You can just use a knife and shave out the rough point itself. The issue with this is it can be very easy to cut too much away. So what I do is I do it up to a certain point like this. I will then test fit the head a few times, mark it with a pencil just to see how deep it is going down and where it might need to be taken away. If you look down the head itself, you can actually then judge, do I need to remove from where the head is sitting, or do I need to remove higher up if I can see a gap in around it? I would suggest using a file. You should invest in a file if you want to make these points anyway, and this will be way more secure and you're way less likely to take off too much material. And what I'm doing here is each time I take a file run of the file up the shaft, I am just rotating the shaft as I go. That way I get a nice even round taper on this rather than just taking too much off one point at any one time. This is a pretty straightforward process, and you just kind of have to rinse and repeat, put the head on, test it, see if it fits, and just keep going over and over until it does. And once you are finished shaping the point, this is what you should be left with. So the point will slide on and sit down onto the shoulder here. So that's what I was talking about earlier. This is the shoulder. This is what the point itself will sit down onto, and that is what our finished point should look like once it is done. So this next step, I'm going to lock my rasp into my vise, and then I'm going to use the rasp to carve some grooves down into the point that I've just carved. The reason for this is it will avoid any air pockets and allow any excess glue to escape from the point. This is what I'm left with, these nice grooves up and down at the point. What I'd recommend doing is roughing up the inside of your head with a bit of sandpaper just to make sure that there's a tight bond here. Then you're just going to add in a bit more of our 2-part epoxy and slide it down onto our shaft like so. As you can see here, sliding this in, having those air pockets allows for any of that excess epoxy to just seep out, and then we just give it a nice wipe, get it all clean, and our head is ready to go. Now the final step in this process is to finish off our fletchings. So for the fletchings themselves, like I said, I like to leave a little bit of excess on each end. This just gives me a little bit of material to work with should I need to. So I'm just going to take my hobby knife once again and just carve each end, the front and the back, into a little taper. And that will just allow my bindings to sit on these a bit easier. So here I'm carving the back end, and then I flip around and carve the front end. This just gives a bit of a rise up on each end for the bindings to bind onto. So for the bindings themselves, I'm using red silk thread. When you start off, fold the string over itself at a bit of a right angle, and then you're just going to bind over here a few times. I like to go over and give myself a fairly solid little patch of about roughly 1 centimeter. And from here I'm going to keep winding the shaft around and around and bring the thread up with me as I go. So I show 2 methods of binding the fletching on in this video. The first one is this one. It's just simply holding the thread in one hand, binding it around, and once I get further up, I'm going to just basically ease the thread down in between the feather and bring it in line with the shaft. So one tip that I found when doing this way is that as you go further up the feather, obviously you'll have to go further back, because if you just go straight down, you're going in line with the feather itself, which means it can be quite awkward to judge the distance. So what I recommend doing is go to the distance that you need and then angle the string back and find the correct part of the feather to go down. So in other words, angle the binding itself at the same angle as the feather and then slide down through the feather there. That will find you the correct distance to correctly bind up and down the feather. How many bindings you do is up to you. I would recommend going at least 4 per inch. Some people go double this. It's really down to personal preference and what sort of aesthetics you like. What you will find is sometimes you might catch some feathers in it, in which case you're just going to have to bring the string back out and try it again. So as you can see here, I'm just winding, finding the angle, sliding down and rotating back over. The other method, which was a little bit more difficult to film, is to use some sort of an object. Here I'm just using a toothpick, but you're going to use this to pry apart the bottom of the feather and rotate it around. I do find this one actually very quick to do. It just took a lot longer to do it in a way where I could film it. But that is an alternative method that you can try. And once you've bound all the way up to the top, you're going to come right up to the end of the feathers like so. And again, I recommend really having a nice tight bind here of roughly about 1 centimeter in thickness. This just gives a nice reinforcement at the end of the bindings themselves, and it will just make sure that everything is nice and solid up at this end of the arrow. So this is the step everyone struggles with the most. So the one bit that caught me out is that you're going to make a loop, but you're going to loop the string back on the opposite side from where you're doing the binding, and then from there you're going to loop the bindings back and through that loop that you've made about 5 or 6 times. It's down to personal preference as to how many times you do that, and this is going to create our knotless knot. So if you wanted to do roughly that centimeter thickness, like I mentioned, take into account that all of the excess material here will go into that binding. So as you can see here, winding around and around, back and through that loop. Can be a little bit finicky with this sort of fine thread, but once we've done that, we're going to lie our excess binding here back down and along the shaft itself. So we're lying that back and down towards the fletching. Then we're going to swap our hands over, and we are going to wrap this nice and tight up into the rest of our bindings. And then we're just going to spin this around and around. As you can see, this pulls all of our material that we just bound right back on top of itself. So we twist this around and around until our material completely runs out. As you can see here, I'm just making sure that it's nice and tight and butted up against the bindings that I've already done. And then once we reach the end here, we have a small bit left. Just make sure everything's bunched in nice and tight. And then that piece we left lying down along our fletching, we're just going to grab that and pull everything through, and that will secure everything into place. So you can see here, grabbing that piece that we have left over, I am left with these 2 loops. So I pull that piece, pulling through, and you will find sometimes the cord itself will snap in on itself, and sometimes it will just pull everything nice and tight back into place here. And then I'm just going to snip off the excess, and that is what we should be left with. So from here then, I'm just going to get a clippers and snip that off. So the very final process I like to do in this is just get some more of my gel super glue and just put a little bit on each end of the bindings. So right here at the beginning and on the opposite end, just to make sure everything is nice and tight and sealed up. It also just helps anything unwinding, especially these front ones. They're the ones that are going to take the most amount of impact. So I like to make sure these are all bunched up nice and tight. And then I'm just going to put a little dollop of this gel super glue in on top, and all this does is just creates a nice hard little buffer on this all the way around the shaft. Well folks, I hope you enjoyed that video. I wanted to outline how you can go about making these arrows with very little equipment at your desk. These methods will work for many different arrows. Obviously you will have to order the shafts. I have put a link down in the description to the company that I use for all of my shafts. It is Dal's Archery. Really highly recommend them. For myself, being in Ireland, there is a lot of issues trying to get archery equipment here. The main ones being a lot of the sort of equipment I need for war bows and high strength bows tend to come from the UK. The issue for that is we face a lot of taxes importing stuff in, so sometimes I will try order stuff from mainland Europe instead. However, Dowell's being in the UK, they really just have the best arrow shafts out there. I will have a full list of tools and links to suppliers in the description. Obviously over time, if you find this video many months down the line, some of those might change. So if they do, pop me a message on social media or pop me an email. Now, I did include some of the things that went wrong in this video, but so far, here are 3 of my nicely finished arrows. Each one's slowly getting better from the last. Now, these are the nice ones. I ordered 8 shafts in this bunch, and the reason that I ordered 8 was normally I like to make my arrows in bunches of 6. And knowing that this would be my first time attempting these arrows, I knew that there'd be a lot of mess ups. So I had basically one sacrificial arrow. This arrow, I've messed up pretty much every part of it. As you can see, the fletching is way too far up the shaft. The bindings are not particularly great. The fletching, as you can see, is a bit all over the place because of the bindings not being done very well. And the shoulder on the shaft is about, I'd say about 5 mils further back than where it should be. This is my first attempt, but even for this, it's not bad for first attempt. This is still a shootable arrow. I will probably still get plenty of joy out of getting to use this thing. And I wanted to show all of you guys out there that you can make these things too if you need to. Especially if you live somewhere like myself where it's difficult to get hold of these supplies without paying a huge amount of money. Especially for someone like myself where I plan on doing tests with these arrows in the upcoming future and similar arrows to these, as well as other interesting projects of a similar nature. So it's a little less cost prohibitive for me to make these myself, and I can also document the process for you guys. Now, if you're interested in these videos and future videos, please do let me know. If there's anything in this video you want me to do in greater detail, I can do that as well. I know certain elements of this I might have skipped over, but I'm more than happy to do full rundowns or even separate videos for any of the components of this video if you want that to be done. So like I said before, there's a lot of fun projects coming in the new year, and over the course of this year there will be a lot of fun archery content. I do plan a lot of interesting stuff, and this was the first one I wanted to get out to you guys, so I do hope you enjoyed it. If you do, please do like and subscribe, and share the video around if you find it useful. And yeah, just thank you all so much for the support. We're almost at 6,000 followers or subscribers, whatever they like to call it on YouTube. But I just can't thank you for enough. It's been amazing. And yeah, hope you all have a good week. It's long.